Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in philosophy we will try to understand postmodernism and its part 2. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Hello viewers. So in the last lecture we talked about the rise of certain kind of ideas after Enlightenment. We try to trace the history of philosophy generally, trying to find out what were the different kind of what are the different ways early philosophers were thinking about things generally. We saw that the use of reasoning and trying to find relationship among ideas, trying to trying to arrive at some kind of formulaic expression for reality as such. These were some of the dominant issues that have been a part of philosophy as a discipline since early Greek times, and we saw how there was for a very long period of time in history. We don't find big leaps and bounds in terms of scientific ideas, but after Enlightenment there was again a rise in such ideas regarding power of reasoning, power of rationality, and there were efforts, especially in Europe, where the parliament, the politics was separated from the overarching influence of religion. Earlier than than Enlightenment, before Renaissance, the church or religion as such was supposed to be the source of ideas, irrespective of whatever domain of thinking we may talk about. So most of the ideas in metaphysics, most of the ideas even in science, most of the ideas in philosophy had to be in conformity with a set of religious ideas that were already prevalent at that time, and the reference point for that used to be Aristotle's ideas, because Aristotle's ideas were very much in keeping with some of the biblical ideas, like world has an origin in time, and all the teleological notions that are inherent in Christianity. So Aristotle seemed to appear like a representative philosopher, who was very much in keeping with, whose ideas were very much in keeping with, in conformity with the biblical ideas. So before Enlightenment, if anybody had any ideas pertaining to heavenly bodies, pertaining to any domain, it had to be, those ideas had to be in conformity, in consonance with some of the biblical themes, some of the dominant biblical ideas. So, but that was challenged. We find these ideas challenged during Enlightenment period, and we see that there is a kind of there is a rise. Now the dominant thinking was that as human beings we have sort of one power, which is one capability which is uniquely given to us, namely that of reasoning and rationality. And it was believed that with the help of this, we can, create a knowledge edifice, so to speak, which would be free from any external influences, and would have certain kind of universality about itself, such that individual differences, perspectives, wouldn't matter, to this kind of methodic account of systematic account of knowledge of things. So it was believed that now we as neutral observers, we could for our answers we could go back to nature. So one of the dominant thinkers of that time, Francis Bacon, gave this call that we for finding answers to some of our queries, like the nature of the things around us, nature of different objects around us. In order to find that, in order to inquire into these questions, we simply need to observe nature. We don't need to go anywhere else, in the sense we don't need to go to scriptures, we don't need to have any final answers, we don't need to look at any final answers from any book, where any sort of justification or any sort of rational justification for those beliefs is not given. So Francis Bacon gave this call that to find answers regarding the nature of the world, we could go back to the nature itself and try and find answers to our queries. As a result, what was happening around that time was all the different domains of knowledge, whether it was political science, whether it was ethics, or whether it was science, arts. All these different domains were freed from the external influences of religion, and now these different disciplines were ready to launch their inquiries independently of any external influences. But as pointed out in the last lecture, the result that we were looking at, as a result, there was one of the dominant ideas that arose at that time was that of humanism, which kept human beings at the center of things, and humanism was an idea with an inherent belief that as human beings, we are capable to give direction, to our times. We know our needs, and human beings are not subject to some kind of, always some kind of divine help or divine intervention. We know that, around that time, there were human beings generally as human subjects. The dominant feeling was that of helplessness. There was spread of disease like plague in Britain and surrounding countries, and there's no help for that. So people only thought that it had some divine cause, and only divine intervention could help them out within the course of events in history. So now that idea was given up, and now this new way of thinking about things in terms of humanism was that as human beings we are capable of defining things for ourselves, and we could give a definite direction to the course of events through power of reasoning. So, but as also pointed out in at the end of the last lecture, it resulted in certain kind of ideas which started appearing in some in some way totalitarian in nature. So two things happening at that time. One was that two world wars that were fought around that time were fought with a different kind of warfare, which resulted in some kind of unprecedented number of casualties, and such kind of destruction had never been witnessed before. So now the problem was that if now, when we were thinking that we were ready to take, the course of history in our hands, then, this was not the kind of, these were not the kind of events probably we were looking forward to. So it created, general mood of dismay and so on and so forth. And apart from that, there were, thinkers like Hegel, who thought that reasoning would take its own course, and eventually there will be something called universal enlightenment, which would take place somewhere in Germany, and there is going to be a definite course that history is going to take, because the essential structure of reasoning is dialectic. And in sort of through that dialectic structure, reason is already set to take a particular course of history, and he sort of mapped out the entire history, that the sort of the history and its projection in future, depending upon sort of his idea of how reasoning works. The inner dynamism of that's inherent in reason. So, but that idea was didn't come as very comfortable for several thinkers of that time, because in this overarching kind of sort of history of ideas that Hegel was working with, individual differences would be ignored. Individual, as an individual, didn't feature prominently anywhere in this history. So it had certain kind of totalitarian absoluteness about itself, which was not a very comfortable idea in terms of politics and so on. So what happened was, there were a particular set of thinkers like Schopenhauer, like Nietzsche, who challenged these ideas, but so what ultimately happened was that as a result of rise of such critiques of rationality that started getting prominence, it ultimately around 1960 it resulted a kind of a movement started taking shape, which we know today as postmodernism. So some of the other things, like how a particular background was created for such postmodernist ideas to emerge. We'll come back to that, but before we do that, let's look at what generally we understand. What is it that we generally understand by the term postmodernism? Actually, the term postmodernism was, came to prominence, after Lyotard used it, in the title of one of his well-known works called The Postmodern Condition. So, in that work, he defines postmodernism as, and I quote, "I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives." Now, this raises another question: what do we understand by meta-narrative? So now Lyotard, rejects, as a part of what he calls meta-narrative. Meta-narrative is generally is importantly a rejection of the idea of master discourse, which later came to be known as meta-narratives. Master discourse that is thought to provide the basis for judgment in all situations. And some of the examples of such kind of master discourse, meta-discourse meta-narratives would be Marxism, Hegelian philosophy, Kant's idea of unity or totality as regulating justice are examples of master discourses that have dominated the philosophical tradition. This is from Internet Encyclopedia for Philosophy. Meta-narrative or grand narrative or master narrative is a term developed by Jean-François Lyotard to mean a theory that tries to give a totalizing, comprehensive account to various historical events, experiences, and social, cultural phenomena based upon the appeal to universal truth or universal values. So the dominant theme, when we talk about meta-narratives, is meta-narratives are basically attempts to organize human experiences, human ideas in accordance with some kind of universal idea of history of that universal idea may come from wherever. It could be, it could spring from some kind of economic idea like in Marx, or it could be sort of some kind of Hegelian idea who talks about dialectics, dialectical reasoning and dialectical materialism that Marx talks about. Or for that matter, Christianity could also be considered as one of such meta narratives, which projects a certain kind of origin in time of when Earth originated, and the Day of Judgment and so on and so forth. So a beginning, a definite beginning of things, and a definite kind of conclusion to it. So just like in times before Enlightenment, there was a dominant theme, and all the ideas, irrespective of whichever disciplines, domains they were coming from, had to be regulated, had to be ordered in terms of the dominant idea around that time, which was which came from Christianity. So Christianity was, the kind of a meta-narrative at that time, and all the other ideas belonging to whatever disciplines had to be regulated, had to be organized in accordance with that, that structure. So Lyotard, says that even after Enlightenment, even when we talk about reasoning, rationality, and so on and so forth, we haven't gone very far from pre-Enlightenment times, in the sense that we still, are working with meta-narratives. It's just that the nature of those meta-narratives has changed. So instead of, sort of Christianity, now, we have other kind of discourses, like, Hegel's, idea of the absolute, like Marx's, like Marxist, idea of dialectical materialism, class struggle, and how, Marx thinks that in history, certain course of, certain events are going to take place which are going to define the course of history, and so on and so forth. So according to Lyotard, the most defining feature of postmodernism is its incredulity towards meta-narratives. So there was some kind of growing discomfort with any totalitarian kind of philosophies, like the Hegelian philosophy and so on and so forth, and there were voices being heard around that time which favored local discourses as opposed to some kind of universal totalitizing kind of philosophies. So this is in a nutshell, very briefly, what generally is supposed to be the dominant idea in postmodernism. So we'll talk more about that, but who were the philosophers who paved the way for this kind of idea to emerge? In our last lecture, we saw that Schopenhauer was probably among the first philosophers who expressed discomfort, some kind of incredulity against the kind of ideas, the kind of philosophy that Hegel was propounding. But Hegel had a lot of popularity around that time, and at a particular point of time, both of them were in the same city, and were supposed to be giving lectures. But for Schopenhauer's lecture, not many people turned up, whereas for Hegel's lecture, it was a full house. So Schopenhauer had a particular kind of disbelief, in power of reasoning. He was of the view that if you look at nature, not carrying any prejudices, giving up all our prejudices and biases, then we'll find that nature seems to be completely without an order. There is no moral principle that seems to be operating. There is just a kind of a unordered will. We all and that will is manifested in all of us. We want to live, we want to carry on, and generally speaking, living in a purely biological sense, in a sort of completely raw sense, involves domination over the weak, and this is what we generally observe in nature. So for Schopenhauer, there is when we look at the way nature is evolving as such, we find that there is no scope for the kind of moral ideas that we have been working with, the kind of ideas we have always held dear to us. So the nature seems to be completely impervious to our moral ideas. And our moral ideas and other kind of ideas, any order that we project onto the world is actually our projection onto it, but nature seems to be completely impervious to kind of projections we are putting upon it. Now this idea is taken further ahead by Nietzsche. Nietzsche, also sort of, he borrows this notion of will from Schopenhauer, and takes it further from there, and he says that what we have been, and he's highly skeptic about the way we had been hitherto philosophizing about things. He was especially critical of Kant, who thought that there could be one sort of there could be one universal principle on the basis of which we could formulate certain kind of moral laws, which which could provide to us some kind of a reference point to always act. According to moral principles, to be able to act always rightly. So he thought through reasoning we could come up with such principles through which we could always understand, we could always have knowledge of what is the right thing to do in a particular circumstances. But Nietzsche was highly skeptical of such attempts. He was of the view that whenever we come up with any philosophies, what we are doing basically is that we are acting according to our nature, and according to our nature, whether it's animals or whether it's us, basically we want to dominate others. And even while giving a kind of a systematic account of our ideas, trying to present a formulaic sort of representation of our ideas, in the garb of what we call universal. He says what we are doing is we are preparing strategies in the name of moralities, different kind of philosophies. What we are doing is we are preparing strategies, putting them before others as if these strategies had a kind of a certain kind of system of their own, which were as if backed by certain kind of reasoning, and therefore have to be admitted by everybody. So, according to him, all the philosophies work that way. As philosophers, we come up with ideas which would give us an upper hand over others, and through which we could, dominate others, in the name of, universality and so on and so forth. So according to him, this is how, whatever kind of, ethical principles, moral principles, that we have ever, come up with. So he says, he talks about Christianity, is very critical of Christianity as well. He says that, see, when we talk about Christianity, what's happening there is that weak who should basically perish, according to him, because, the nature doesn't have a space for weak. So, in order to to be able to preserve themselves, in order, to make their survival possible, the kind of philosophy they'd come up with, is kind of Christian philosophy, like, you sort of talk, you give certain kind of, you come up with some kind of a value system, which kind of exalts others to help the weak, like, we find such phrases in Bible like blessed are the meek, blessed, the sort of weak would get sort of entry into the heaven, first of all. So, meekness, generally sort of, giving up your will, these are some of the ideas which are considered important and valuable in the dominant moral systems that were there around the time of Nietzsche. So he says all these systems of morality, all different kinds of philosophies are there because those are basically power strategies. Say for example Christianity is is a strategy which favors the weak, who actually, as a matter of fact, should perish because nature is like that. Nature always works that way, that the strong should survive and weak should perish. With the survival of weak is not a good idea, if you look at nature generally. So he says, nature is completely, without so to speak, there's hardly any order in nature, and if there is any at all, then that is too kind of crude, too raw, to have any to prepare any philosophical account of. So therefore he looks very suspiciously at any moral accounts, any philosophical accounts that different philosophers prior to him had come up with, and he he argued against them. We will look more at that after a short break. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So before the break we were talking about Nietzsche, and we were trying to look at how Nietzsche gives a different turn to philosophy, and how he prepares some kind of a groundwork for later postmodernist ideas to emerge. So what is important in that regard is the idea of will that he comes up with. He looks at philosophies and moral systems as mere strategies which favor those people, those philosophers who have come up with those philosophies. He wanted to decenter philosophy tried to present a very different kind of a paradigm for philosophical ideas, which involved going beyond, sort of earlier ideas of good and evil, and trying to see, sort of the ideas, dominant ideas regarding good and evil, in terms of how they have come, how they have arisen at all. So, we should look at, the ideas of good and evil as if, those were some kind of objects to be examined. We need to look at, what are the different kind of forces which are working in shaping of those ideas, and what are the different kind of strategies, that are involved, while in the shaping of those ideas. So he talked about what later came to be known as transvaluation of values. So he was of the view that we should consider values. We shouldn't take the prevalent set of values as objects given to us, but should look at them, examine them in terms of what are the different forces, external influences that are shaping them. So these were some of the dominant ideas that Nietzsche came up with. Then another another important philosopher for us to take up in this regard is Wittgenstein. As we are aware, there were a number of philosophers in especially in England, who thought that language had a structure about itself, and it in a certain way represented reality of the world outside, because language sort of refers to the world outside. It is basically, the structure of language is in consonance with the structure of reality outside, and therefore if we examine the language closely, if we examine the structure closely, if we are able to able to look deeply enough into it, we might be in that process able to unravel the actual structure of the world, and that's going to be of huge importance for us. So there were a number of philosophers, including Bertrand Russell, who thought that ordinary language does occasionally create certain instances of misunderstanding for us. So probably we could have an sort of deeper insight into the structure of language, and could come up with a more refined language through which we could do away with such kind of misunderstanding. And once we are able to discover some such kind of structure, then that particular kind of a structure would act like a reference point for us, and we would be able to do away with any sort of misunderstanding that could ever occur, and that they'll work as a kind of a final principle for us to thresh away meaningless propositions from the meaningful ones. So now Wittgenstein comes here as a very important philosopher in especially in this domain, because he worked closely with Russell during the early part of his career. And he thought that the kind of enterprise that Russell was getting involved himself with seemed to him to be a kind of a viable option, and he thought that it could be done. He worked on that and came up with a work called Tractatus, where he tried to come up with kind of theories according to which language pictures the reality, and each word in a sentence is a picture, is representative of some kind of object out there in the world. But within that text, by at the very end, he he gives us a dominant idea that in order to examine language, we need to have some kind of outside of it, in the sense that like when you're examining an object, if you want to examine language as such, as an object of examination, as an object of inquiry, it'll be good if we are able to get outside of it, and get a kind of a vantage point, objective vantage point to it, and then examine it. But he sort of he points out that there is no outside of language. Sort of even to philosophize about language, we will have to sort of we'll have to work from within, because language doesn't have an outside of it, because our thinking happens within language. So whatever thoughts, even if those thoughts are about language, have to be within the language. So in that sense, this kind of idea, according to which we could examine our language for some kind of inherent structures, in-depth structures, and if we are able to discover those, then all sort of misunderstanding from language would go. Wittgenstein became suspicious of this project. And he sort of submitted this idea that since language has no outside of it, so such kind of enterprise is in a certain way flawed right from the beginning. So in his later work, there are several of them, but dominantly his book titled Philosophical Investigations, he arrives at a completely different idea regarding language, and he takes a complete departure from his earlier stance, earlier philosophical stance, which was very much in proximity with Bertrand Russell's. So now later Wittgenstein was of the view that language is not, hasn't involved, it's not designed with, in accordance with the purpose that philosophers, have in mind. Language, is designed, basically has evolved, for the purpose of communication. So, and when it comes to communication, it seems to be working fine. So what he has to say is that he comes up with the idea of language games. We'll talk about that. He comes up with an idea that there is no outside of language. So there is no vantage point outside the language from where we could examine it. And meanings that we find in language basically result from customs and practices. So there are prior customs and practices, and when words are uttered in the background of those customs and practices, they become meaningful, and outside of those customs and practices, they wouldn't be meaningful in the same way. So, the idea is that language is not designed to cater to the needs of philosophers. Language is for communication, for the purpose of communication, and it is performing that function pretty fine, pretty well. There are no grand in-depth structures in language. There are instead, he presents this idea, what he calls language games. So he says, language doesn't have some kind of a grand design, which once discovered, would solve all our philosophical issues. There'll be once we discover that, we know the structure of the world, and we have, and when we discover what we actually sort of as philosophers we want to ever discover. So he says, as opposed to that, he gives us this idea of language games, according to which a language is designed for basically communication, and when we communicate with each other, we are sort of working within the background of certain practices, and it is within the gamut of those customs and practices that language words come to have meaning at all. So he gives the example of a toolbox. So when we open a toolbox, we are confronted with certain kind of tools, and if we know the background of it, we know how to use those tools. So he says similarly, words in language are like tools. We must understand sort of the context, the background to it, and then those tools all of a sudden will start making a lot of sense to us. And in the absence of background of such self practices, such cultural practices, and so on. This kind of, like, I mean, these tools wouldn't make sense to us. So according to him, meanings result from local communications that we have with each other, what he calls language games. And the instances of those language games are often unique in nature, and each language game, so to speak, is kind of unique in itself, where two people or two or more people talk with each other, and they have certain cultural background that they that they are working with, and certain shared meaning that they are working with. And it's within within that shared pool of meaning that it's within that shared pool that meanings start emerging at all. So apart from that, there wouldn't be much of meaning coming forth to us. So he says, therefore, there are these language games that we engage ourselves with all the time. And instead of having some kind of a definite center to the language, which was in the earlier idea that language has a particular kind of a structure, has some kind of center to it, which once we discover, we would be able to order everything. We in language we would be able to order all our ideas, and in accordance with that central structure. That kind of idea is completely demolished by later Wittgenstein. So he says that kind of idea is instead replaced by what he calls language games. In language games, we don't find one definite center, which defines all the language games. Instead, what we have is what he calls crisscross and overlapping. So there are certain similarities. If there are two language instances of language games happening at two different places, there would be just some kind of resemblances here and there. There would be overlappings. There will be crisscross pattern, and when we put a entire gamut of different language games, different instances of language games across cultures, across geographical boundaries, what will come up with would be certain kind of patches, certain kind of collage where there'll be certain structures overlapping each other on certain points, not overlapping certain others at other points, and so on and so forth. So there would be similarities and resemblances, differences, and there'll be some kind of pattern like that would emerge. But there wouldn't be any definite center, to such structures. So he, in a certain sense, decenters, the language, the structure of language in a certain way, and then comes up with an entirely different kind of paradigm regarding the study of language, where any any kind of definite structure that about language that we were earlier working with is kind of given up in favor of more local instances of communicating with each other, that he calls language games, and so on and so forth. So this idea was very much in keeping with postmodernist ideas that emerged later on, which favored local, as opposed to the universal, discourses. So apart from that, I want to talk about consciousness studies. One major departure, we find in that area after Freud, after Sigmund Freud. another German thinker around the time. So Freud died in 1939 during the Second World War. And by the time and by that time he had sort of bequeathed to us some revolutionary ideas regarding how our mind functions, regarding how regarding the structure of consciousness that we have. So earlier than that, the idea was that mind is some kind of an open function. I mean, in the sense that like we are always aware of what we are thinking. We are always aware of ourselves. It sort of worked like the way sort of Descartes sort of gave us a kind of idea regarding mind, where we were in a certain way in charge of our ideas. And whenever we wanted to, we could as if empty out all the ideas. So mind in such kind of framework appears like a kind of a container of ideas, which a kind of a container that you could always empty out at will. And what you would be left with after that process would be some kind of a pure consciousness which thinks at will in ways you want it to, and so on and so forth. So earlier idea of consciousness was that we are aware whenever I sort of look into my mind. I have access to whatever is happening over there. I have access to all the ideas that are there in my mind at that time, and it's a kind of an open access in the sense that I know, I'm aware of what's going on inside me. As opposed to that, Freud presents an idea of consciousness which is full of complexities, and and he comes up with a kind of idea where things like moral agency, things like several other things start running into problems. So earlier in ethics, the idea was that I'm a free thinker, and I sort of based solely on the principle of pure reason, I could come up with certain moral principles, certain principles according to which I could come up with a maxim which could be universalizable. That was Kant's idea, and if I work on the basis of that maxim, they'll have some kind of a command in terms of the categorical imperative force that it would have, and and it'll be eventually the right thing to do. So I'm a free agent. The idea was that I am a free agent. I have access to sort of free reasoning, objective kind of reasoning. I always have access to my mind, my reasoning faculties, and so on and so forth. Now Freud problematizes this earlier idea and says that the part of our mind which is conscious is actually a minuscule part, and it's just the proverbial tip of the iceberg, and what we call our conscious mind actually has at the back of it certain other kind of sections of mind, which could be subconscious, which could also be even unconscious. So mind has sort of a hierarchy of structure, and the conscious mind that we thought was that we had earlier thought all there was to consciousness, all there was to mind, is actually a minuscule part of it. So in Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality, the unconscious mind is a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that outside of our consciousness, that is kind of outside of our conscious awareness. Most the contents of the unconscious realm of mind are unacceptable or unpleasant, such as feeling of pain, anxiety, or conflict. And so, basically the idea is, he presents, some of these ideas in his work called Civilization and Its Discontents. So there, what he talks about is that, after Enlightenment, after, the rise of, this renewed faith in the power of reasoning and so on and so forth, a certain kind of idea arose according to which we thought that there could be certain structuring principles, certain conscious structuring principles according to which we could have sort of we could structure our societies, we could have we could structure any forms of collectivities, and the rules that were govern those collectivities in social terms, in political terms, and so on and so forth. So some kind of order was necessary, for society, for political reasons, and so on and so forth. But he says, that such kind of sort of ordering ideas, ordering principles are erected upon what he calls sarcophagus of some of the human impulses, creative impulses, and according to him, we have certain biological, creative impulses who are more defining of us than what we call reasoning as such. So, according to him, what happens is that since these urges, these inner urges, libidinal, subliminal urges, are the main defining characteristic of us. When we start talking about certain kind of ordering principles, whether those could be based on reasoning or whatever, these ordering principles get into conflict with some of these libidinal forces that are more characterizing of us, and as a result what happens is it starts creating services, it starts creating disruptions, it starts creating aporias in our subliminal sort of unconscious, subconscious parts of our mind. And since what we call sort of conscious mind is basically all the time in a very subtle way connected with our subconscious and unconscious realms of mind, if there are any disruptions occurring in the deep structures of our mind, eventually they start surfacing up and start influencing our conscious mind as well, and result is certain kind of neurosis. And since all our behavior, the way we act, is always sort of guided by quote unquote conscious part of our mind, sort of and like our manifest behavior has to have certain kind of order. I mean, say for example, whether there is a need to wear clothes or not, irrespective of the kind of whether we do wear clothes, there are certain customs that we follow. There are certain institutions we have come up with, like marriage and so on and so forth, basically because there has to be certain kind of order that has to be maintained within society, without which there would be a lot of chaos. There will be a lot of fighting with each other, use of force that will start happening, and which would as a matter of fact more of a manifestation of our inner urges, libidinal kind of forces which are more characterizing of us. So Freud gives us a map of which is full of complexities. Earlier we never thought that that what we call mind is actually such a complex system. So now when Freud presented us a very different kind of a map of how ideas emerge within the conscious mind, how we come up with certain kind of ordering principles on the basis of which we come up with ideas regarding social structures, political structure, and so on and so forth, and how these structuring principles, these ideas on the basis of which we structure our social collectivities, are, very often, like almost always, in conflict with, deep urges, deep libidinal forces, that are, more characteristic, more defining of us as human beings. So, like when he comes up also with this idea, regarding what he calls ego and id. Id is, that part of our personality which is, sort of guided more by, sort of subliminal, libidinal sort of forces. It has a very different kind of dynamism of its own, whereas id, is the part of our personality which kind of evolves, shapes itself up in its engagement with the other, with the other in the sense of, like not only the other persons, but in this other in the sense of social collectivities, political structures, and so on and so forth. So, like sort of some of the dominant findings that, Sigmund Freud came up with were that consciousness or mind does not have a unitary structure all through. There are three parts to our personality, according to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. These are the ego, id, and superego. The ego consists of, our conscious decision making. The id is, our instinctual biological component, and the superego is the social component of our personality and our conscience. So, and also mind it that we make our best efforts that our id is such that there is minimum of conflicts happening between our self that engages with others in terms of social collectivities also, and and the part of the self that is intimately my own, which is characterized by id. But we try that there is not much of friction between the two, but very often the conflicts arise between these two realms, and it results in different kind of neuroses, which is for psychoanalysts to study. One such example would be sort of schooling. Schools are always supposed to have certain kind of structures where certain kind of teaching is imparted to the learners, which also involves principles regarding how to behave ourselves in certain kind of collectivities. There's supposed to be certain kind of uniform structures, which also includes school uniforms. So certain kind of order is very clearly visible in school structures, which is the main component of it all. But apart from that, the learner, the children studying there also have their inner impulses, inner instincts, creative impulses, which not always are in sync with the way teaching is done in school. So it happens not only at school level, but social collectivities also demand of us the same kind of conforming kind of sort of behavior patterns. There are certain institutions that which sort of want to have some command over us as individuals. And as a result, what happens is that our id, along with its subliminal libidinal impulses, gets into conflict with some kind of a more overarching kind of structures, which are vying to sort of get hold of us, to sort of which are vying to structure our behavior as such. And so therefore the importance of Sigmund Freud's ideas basically lies in the fact that he challenges in a big way, in a huge way, the earlier notion of mind and consciousness that we were working with, according to which that the mind had a kind of sort of it was like a sort of a very visible spread out kind of a play field for us, and it was visible all through. It was at our command in the sense we could choose ideas that we wanted to be there. We could sort of banish certain ideas that we didn't want to be there. That kind of sort of unitary structure, conceptualization of the structure of mind, that is challenged by Freud in a huge way, where he points out that the conscious mind is just a very minuscule part. It's a very complex structure where sort of we are not always in command of our ideas, and there are sort of there are certain things outside of our control which command the conscious so-called conscious sort of play field of our mind. So today, for the paucity of time, we'll stop at this. Maybe in the next lecture we'll talk about we will focus on some of the more dominant thinkers, more dominant sort of like names like Derrida and Foucault, but we will leave that for the next lecture. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very
Thanks.
enriching discussion, and thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.